Hi, folks. This is the last day in August, and I realize it's been an awful 2 weeks for many reasons for many of you, and also a very sort of depressing week of conventions. But today I want to talk mainly about climate-related changes because interesting things have been happening. But before I do so, I want to respond to a couple of, or two or three actually, emails that I got raising a question about the United Arab Emirates. So let me just take 1 minute to say that there are 7 of them, and they're really city-states. And the whole area has a population of about 10 million people, 9 something. And well, you've heard of places like Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And today, if you listen to the news, a delegation of Israelis and Americans flew to Dubai for the first time. So that's a kind of a breakthrough. Dubai, interestingly enough, is something we've all heard about, but 3/4 of the United Arab Emirates are in fact just desert, right? So they're concentrated in these cities. And Dubai is very important and increasingly important because it's a big financial center. And as things get messy with China and the United States and so forth, more and more financial things go through Dubai. So it's not just a place in the desert, but it's taken on global importance of various kinds. Anyway, I want to move on to climate change. The first thing to say, I suppose, is that many of the things that have been going on, the crises that we've witnessed, the fires in California, the hurricanes in Louisiana and Texas, things we haven't heard about as much as 1/4 of all of Bangladesh has been underwater. Lots of flooding in Korea, all kinds of places have had serious weather impacts, which are by and large, or at least the seriousness, are by and large the consequence of global warming. The second interesting thing that's happened in the last few weeks is because of the economic downturn of the COVID virus, and in part in California because of the fires, there have been impacts on climate change. So the fires are obvious, right? We're still breathing the ash and so forth. But for many places in the world, including major cities in the United States and around the world, Beijing, New Delhi, all kinds of places, the downturn of the economy as well as the virus have combined to lead to a lot less traffic. And all of a sudden, the air in those countries has improved vastly. And so people say, whoa, just having fewer cars around and fewer industries puffing away during these, because of these other crises, has cleared the air. So that might be the solution, to just have, fewer cars, fewer carbon dioxide in the air, and so on. Well, there's some truth to that, but there are also consequences to that. And one of the consequences of having fewer cars and trucks driving around and clearing the air a bit is that the oil and gas industries are not selling their product. And this has increasingly become important for these major industries whose bottom line is getting smaller and smaller, and they have sort of panicked, is that the right word? But in any event, they are distraught, as are stockholders, and some of you may own stock in some of these industries, stockholders of these industries. So now what to do? One of the things that the industries have done, that is to say the petroleum industry, the gas industry, have tried to figure out how to quickly change to other productions. And if those of you who read the New York Times, you might have seen a front page story today about how these industries are making more and more plastics, because petroleum is used to make plastics, and are trying to dump plastics onto the third world. That is to say, both the sale of plastics, for example, plastic bags to go shopping, which we by and large aren't supposed to use anymore, and who are the recipients of a lot of the pressure of the petroleum industry for countries to absorb plastics. The African continent, wouldn't you think, as well as places like Indonesia, to some extent India, but mainly Africa. So there has two consequences. One is more plastics get sold, the industry has its income stream. The other is, of course, the plastics are mostly one-use plastics, and then they wind up polluting the air, polluting the rivers, polluting the reservoirs, polluting the streets, and making a holy mess of plastic everywhere. And as we know, plastic is difficult to get rid of. So one crisis, namely the weather and the fires and the virus, three crises, I guess, leads to an industry doing poorly, which leads to an industry morphing into doing alternative things. And these alternative things produce a new and to some extent long-term and more serious crisis of littering the world with plastic. So this chain is difficult to follow on a daily basis, but you can see how almost anything nowadays has a kind of global impact and a chain reaction. And we may keep saying, you know, America first, we're not going to have global relations and so forth. But American industries, of course, are dependent on not just selling things in the United States, but selling things overseas. And the petroleum industry, which is in deep doo-doo right now, is making a havoc of a new problem in various parts of the world that can least afford them and can least resist them. So that's one issue. Another issue is the ongoing circumstances that produce, for example, the fires in California, which has to do with lack of rain, lack of all kinds of protections for the forests, the fact that so many people build housing and other structures in forests in areas that are not safe over the years, thinking they were safe. So we have, especially in California, but also in some other states, huge potential problems of these fires generated by climate change, or at least fostered by climate change, and then themselves impacting on other climate change issues. So one has a kind of a chain reaction, which is hard to focus on when we're focused on, you know, the ash in our air and our own or our friends' houses burning down. But I just want to call attention to that. Then, meantime, new studies have emerged which show problems with climate change down the line, which are actually quite interesting, and I want to share with you. So generally speaking, it is thought that the climate change and weather problems and water issues that we have nowadays are the result of 1.2, 1.5 degrees increase in warming, okay? And that in turn is said that if by 2030, by 2030, it goes up to 2% or slightly beyond that, we're all in deep doo-doo. Water levels will rise everywhere, more fires, more hurricanes, or stronger hurricanes, and so forth. So scientists have studied this problem, and there is a fairly new study, which is interesting, which suggests if we, in the next 2 or 3 years, reduce pollutants of certain kinds by 5%, when will it help impact climate change? And that is actually quite stunning, because a 5% reduction in pollutants of carbon dioxide will not really make a huge difference until 2040. A 5% decrease in methane gas won't impact until 2050. And a 5% decrease in nitric oxides will not even have an impact until 2080. Now that seems illogical, right? If you stop doing something bad, why doesn't it have an impact? Because the process that goes through the atmosphere and goes through the water takes a long time to impact on actually producing changes. In short, the stuff that didn't go into the air, carbon dioxide, for example, because of less driving and an economic downturn, won't really seriously impact climate change until 2040, which is stunning, right? Which in fact means that while obviously we need to reduce putting pollutants in the air, we shouldn't expect a fast turnaround of any kind. And that I think we haven't mentally gotten adjusted to, because we think, okay, if we improve this, we improve that, then the climate change won't be as big a problem. Well, if we don't do X and Y, climate change will get worse and worse in the next 10 years. That this is true. But in terms of actually bringing us back to a sustainable circumstance, in terms of water not rising, in terms of storms, hurricanes becoming less serious, of all kinds of things, that is going to take decades. So, I mean, what does that say? It says not in our lifetime will these things really get better. But it also says, of course, if we don't hustle to improve things very quickly, things will get worse and worse, and they will be very bad by 2030. Okay, so does that make logical sense to you? That the long term is very long term in terms of real improvements. In the short term, if we don't do things and reduce by pollutants of all kinds by at least 5%, by 2030, things will be very serious. Now, you know, there's a lot of hand-wringing about all of this, but oddly enough, there are people, and even, I don't just mean random people, I also mean governments who are trying to do something. And for the first time under the radar, first time, let's say seriously in a year, certainly in the United States, under the radar, mitigation measures are beginning to be made. That is to say, the state of Louisiana, the state of New York, for example, have reconciled to themselves to the fact that if they don't start doing something within the next 10 years, they will be swamped by water. Whole communities will go away, not just when hurricanes come, but in terms of water level rising. And so mitigation measures have to be taken. We are beginning in the United States to remove whole communities from the coastline. And that has been advocated for some years, but it's only fairly recently that municipalities, state governments have seriously said to themselves, if we don't get people stop living on the shore of New Jersey, on the shores of Louisiana, on probably after this latest hurricane, on some of the shore areas in Texas, if we don't start doing something about the water levels rising around New York and Manhattan is eventually going underwater, if mitigations, barriers and so forth aren't built, we'll all be in trouble. So remarkably enough, it's not just the Sierra Club and climate activists, but it's governments. It may very well be, to some extent, these, you know, radical left Republican, Democratic governments that Trump likes to criticize. But it's all Louisiana's Republican, right? But the responsible government officials in various states are saying we better do mitigation. Now, the mitigation is very expensive because you don't just move people, you have to provide different kind of housing. And I would suspect that we in California will begin to do mitigation soon as well. For example, will mitigation measures be taken up in the hills in Santa Cruz, and people in you know, serious fire danger areas will be encouraged to move, or at least not expand into the rural areas? there has been much expansion into beautiful rural areas in California and in state of Washington and Oregon and in some places in New England, because as people have become more affluent, they have second homes, and sometimes when they retire, they permanently move out of cities into their second home. And so nobody has been watching this process. It has been very pleasant for individuals and families, but it is asking for trouble in terms of the future well-being and the dangers because of climate change and weather pattern changes for many parts of states and within the United States. So what I'm saying here is that for the first time, we're beginning, it's baby steps, we're beginning to say climate mitigation measures need to be taken in the sense of putting less pollutants in the air, so that sometime in the middle and late 20th century, before you get to 21st century, you slow down the climate change. But it's absolutely clear that it can't be slowed down enough in the next 10 years not to raise havoc in various places for water rising level reasons, for forest fires, for the type of buildings that are built that can or cannot sustain hurricanes and so on. It's interesting. It's under the radar. It's not too much discussed as yet, but it's happening. And certainly as citizens, we should encourage our local authorities as well as our state authorities to, even for here in Santa Cruz, to say, okay, water level rise expected in the next 10 years is the following: which communities along the water need to be moved before people drown and lose their houses and are very costly to taxpayers to try to rescue, and so on. So I think that's an interesting development. Now, water mitigation measures were recommended when New Orleans was water rising some years ago. And the Dutch, who are at the forefront of knowing how to deal with water mitigation, came to New Orleans and recommended to the authorities in Louisiana that they should do X and Y. And we, in our arrogance as Americans, said, we don't need your help, go back home. But I think that now that more mitigation measures are in the cards and have to be, contemplated, it may very well be that wise states go to those countries that have some experience with all of this. And the Dutch, as I said, are at the forefront of building buildings that float rather than that sit on the ground, building barriers and walls and so on. So there is a science and an architecture of this, and we would be well to acquaint ourselves, we meaning the United States, would be well to acquaint ourselves with, and hope that the Environmental Protection Agency would perhaps, if there is a post-Trump, would perhaps take this matter up. In the meantime, of course, on the national official scene, the Environmental Protection Agency has killed about, I think it's almost 100 or slightly over 100 of the rules and regulations which have environmental impact, which were passed under the Obama administration. So now you can throw chemicals back into rivers, but you can also, for example, or you don't have to, for example, pay attention to the environmental impact studies that were required for new structures. So that was a long and tedious process. Whether a road or a bridge was going to be built, whatever public works took place, needed to go through a process of environmental impact. That's now gone away. Trump got rid of that. So in terms of some things, it will obviously expedite building things, which might be a good thing for work and the economy. On the other hand, it could also have serious long-term consequences because, for example, if you're going to build any more bridges in the near future, you better take water rise into consideration and expected environmental impact into consideration. So the fact is that some municipalities, some states are moving forward in mitigation measures. And at the same time, our federal government has gotten rid of not just mitigation measures, but also rules and regulations which would help mitigation measures of one kind or another. So I'm essentially now talking about the United States and other industrial countries and what they need to do and what they must do. What you do about the rest of the world is really unclear because, as I said, Bangladesh, Indonesia, parts of Africa along the coast and so forth also will get flooding, and it will require funds, typically coming from affluent industrial countries like the United States, also coming from US agencies, all of which are in difficulty because of the economic downturn, or in the case of the United States, about the bad policies in terms of foreign aid and supporting international institutions which could help countries. A country like China is big enough and to some extent rich enough to try to fund these things on their own. On the other hand, as I've talked about in previous talks, the Chinese building the various pathways of the Silk Road are themselves sometimes doing environmental harm with dams and blocking rivers, which are leading to flooding and all kinds of things. So the Chinese, on the one hand, have capacity, on the other hand, have a desire to build that belt and road from China through Asia and to the Middle East and even Europe, and they're not being very cautious. So the idea here is that, yes, some rich countries could do these mitigation measures on their own. Some countries can learn from other countries how to do the mitigation efforts, but it all takes a lot of money. And it probably is money well spent by the government and governments, state and local as well, to do these mitigation measures rather than letting things get out of control in the next 10 years. And have an even costlier and life-threatening problems on their hands. The global economic downturn based on the COVID virus, on the other hand, has reduced both the resources and the will to help other countries in the world that need to do something. And of course, that gets you back to my previous topic 2 weeks ago, which has to do with migrations and such things, because if people simply can't operate on their land anymore, either because it's flooded or because of drought, also weather-related, climate change-related, they will try to move into other countries. So it is in the interest of industrial countries, including the United States, to help others mitigate in the years to come. But at the moment, we're so consumed with ourselves and so unwilling to see ourselves as part of a global scene. That of course is unlikely right now. But certainly the politics of the United States, which has been focused rightly on Black Lives Matter and the COVID virus, really needs to include climate change, mitigation measures as a top agenda item and not as an afterthought, because matters are getting very serious, as I said, in the next 10 years, but they're increasingly getting serious and they really cannot be mitigated unless there is a serious reduction very soon. They cannot even be mitigated in terms of changing the atmosphere and changing the water for decades to come if we start now, and we're clearly not starting now. So on the one hand, I'm predicting dire things, more depressing news always coming from me. On the other hand, I'm also saying that there is beginning to be a waking up, not just of individuals, but also of government, local, state, and hopefully in the future, federal government in the United States, to say that climate change, once we've gotten past this virus mess, is not something that is an afterthought that some Sierra activists are interested in, but really has to do with the survival of our economy, our housing, our well-being of people, and for that matter, the lives of people if things are not done and they're swallowed up by floods and high waters. So there's both very bad news on the climate change front, and then there's the beginning of waking up, and that is good news. And I know you get bored with listening to me and others, so I'll make this short this week and see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.